Welcome back to yet another video where we're going to look at old school Yu-Gi-Oh card effects and talk about why they're so weird. Now in this series we look at the very oldest card text that we can find back when there wasn't a great standard for how to write effects, which makes a lot of weird situations happen. As always, this series is not meant to compare or contrast the meta games from old versus new school Yu-Gi-Oh, but rather only focus on how the cards themselves were written, because that certainly has gotten better over the years. If you haven't seen them already, make sure after watching this video you go watch episode 1 and 2, just because there might be a card that you thought should have been in this video that I might have already covered in the past. First up, I just want to say that a lot of people pointed out that many more cards besides Waboku were written in a similar way. I'm not going to cover all of these individually. There's things like Rocket Warrior and that weird Gravekeeper's Hand Trap. Waboku is not the only card apparently that says the damage was reduced to 0, and actually meant that the monster couldn't be destroyed by battle. I knew about Hollowed Life Barrier, of course, but I wasn't really aware about how many other cards were written in a similar way. I should mention, if you're interested in learning more about Waboku specifically, I made an entire video dedicated to breaking down its effect. Anyway, onto the first old weird card effect in today's video, Darkness Approaches. Now you probably have heard of this card. It is kind of a big meme in the community. This is a normal magic card that says discard 2 cards from your hand, select one face-up monster and flip it face down, but do not change its battle position, which meant that Darkness Approaches was the only card in Yu-Gi-Oh that technically could flip a monster into face down attack position. Now face down attack position, even though it's not in the rule book, technically is basically just like face down defense position. If you attack it, it gets flipped face up and then you apply damage calculation as you normally would. That being said, this card is pretty terrible even by old school standards. It's basically a double discard requirement on a Book of Moon that's not a quick play spell, which makes it pretty darn bad. What you might not know though is that Darkness Approaches actually did have its effect updated in the last few years. Back when Master Rule 4 was initially introduced into the Yu-Gi-Oh TCG, Konami updated a bunch of old text on cards like Darkness Approaches. So the new text of this card says discard 2 cards from your hand, select one face-up monster and change it to face down defense position. There is no official printing of this card with this effect. Maybe someday they'll reprint it, maybe on like an OTS pack or something along those lines, but right now this is what the card actually does, which means we have no cards that deal with face down attack position. Next up we have Relinquished, which actually had the longest amount of effect text on any card in Yu-Gi-Oh, and it still left off a pretty important piece of information. Relinquished also is the best example of extremely confusing and convoluted text on an older school Yu-Gi-Oh card. Honestly, like the first 4 printings of this card were kind of a mess, but let's take a look at the original one to really see where it all started. This monster can take on the attack and offense of one opponent's monster on the field. A face down monster results in an attack and offense of 0. Treat the selected monster as an equipped magic card and use it to equip Relinquished. You may use this effect only once per turn and can equip Relinquished with only one monster at a time. When your opponent's monster attacks this monster with an attack higher than Relinquished, the equipped monster is destroyed instead of Relinquished. Any life point damage you receive from the attacking monster while Relinquished is equipped is also inflicted on your opponent. This card is an absolute mess to read and understand with this original text. A lot of people in the past 2 videos mentioned that back in old school days they didn't really understand that this card needed to be ritual summoned, because it doesn't actually mention that anywhere in the original text. Now in the past I know I've mentioned that it's important to put some rulings in the rulebook instead of on the actual cards, but keep in mind here that Magic Ruler was the very first set with ritual monsters, which means it would be pretty important to explain how the cards actually work in their actual effects. Keep in mind here that all the other ritual monsters released in Magic Ruler actually do say that they need to be ritual summoned with their proper ritual spell. This created a lot of problems because a lot of people mentioned that they would special summon this thing with like Marauding Captain because they didn't know any better. That's not even that unreasonable, because you might have bought a bunch of packs and pulled your Relinquished without actually pulling the ritual spell. In that case, you have literally no idea how to summon this thing or the fact that it has any restrictions at all. You might just read the effect and say, well, it doesn't mention any ritual spell or anything along those lines. I guess I can summon it without using a ritual spell. I think comparing the original version of Relinquished that we just looked at, where the effect literally doesn't even fit in the text box, to the most recent version of the card really makes you appreciate problem-solving card text. It says you can ritual summon this card card with Black Illusion Ritual. Once per turn, you can target one monster your opponent controls, equip that target to this card, maximum 1. This card's attack and defense become equal to that equipped monster's. If this card would be destroyed by battle, destroy that equipped monster instead. While equipped with that monster, any battle damage you take from battles involving this card inflicts equal effect damage to your opponent. This version of the card is obviously written in a much less confusing way, despite the fact that it actually fits more information on the card because now it mentions the ritual spell. Next up we have Reverse Trap, and this is actually a very unique situation. With many of the cards that we've looked at over the past couple of episodes, you've seen their effects actually get shorter over time as the standard for writing card effects became a lot more concise. In the case of Reverse Trap though, it actually needed more text to fully explain how the card worked. The original version of this card simply says all increases and decreases to attack and defense are reversed for the turn in which this card is activated. Now that might not sound that confusing, and on paper I suppose it's not, but it seems like there were two groups of people that understood Reverse Trap in different ways. One group of people thought that if you equipped Axe of Despair to something and flipped Reverse Trap, the monster would go back to its original attack value. The second group of people thought that the attack value of the monster would now decrease by 1,000. Honestly, with reading this old school effect, I think that either way could be argued, but the most recent printing of the card clarifies what it actually does. This one says until the end phase, all effects that add or subtract attack or defense are reversed. And then in parentheses, it clarifies additions now subtract and subtractions now add instead. Multiplications and divisions, including halving/doubling, are not affected. Like I said, in most cases in this series, you're going to see cards actually lose words as the newer versions come out because Konami has figured out a more concise way to explain what they do. In the case of this card though, you actually really need all the extra text to truly explain what the card actually does in a variety of situations. Next up we have Last Will, which to be fair was released in Starter Deck Yugi, so it's one of the first cards ever released into the Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG, so its effect is a little bit confusing. The original version of Last Will was a normal magic card, of course, we didn't have spell cards back then, and it said if a monster of yours is sent from the field to the graveyard during the turn that you've played this card, you can select a monster with an attack of 1,500 points or less from your deck and play it as a special summon. Shuffle the deck after playing this card. This card is active for one turn only. Some of the parts of this card come down to it just being very, very old. Play it as a special summon, for example, is one of the many weird ways that Konami used to write special summon effects. We looked at like Monster Reborn in a previous video that also was written in a pretty strange way. The parts that really don't make sense about this card are the last two sentences. Shuffle the deck after playing this card doesn't really make sense because why would you shuffle the deck immediately after using it? What it really is referring to is that you shuffle the deck after the special summon happens. This card is active for one turn only, sort of implies that it stays face up on the field after being played. The other part about this card that doesn't really make a lot of sense with the original version is that you're supposed to use this card after meeting the requirements, but this original text actually sort of implies that you play it at like the start of your turn or anywhere in the turn. It stays face up until the activation requirement is met, and then you perform the special summon, and then it goes to the graveyard. This is also a weird situation where the most recent printing of Last Will is actually from 15 years ago, back in 2005 in Tournament Pack 7. However, this printing of the card actually does make a lot more sense, despite not being written with problem-solving card text. This version of the card says if a monster on your side of the field was sent to the graveyard this turn, you can special summon one monster with an attack of 1,500 points or less from your deck once during this turn. Then shuffle your deck. We obviously still get a lot of old school charm with the most recent printing of Last Will, specifically the shuffling your deck part, but generally speaking, it's a lot more understandable than the original print. And finally, the last card we're going to talk about in today's video is Penguin Knight. Now this is a very strange situation. The card actually does have two printings, but both of them have pretty big issues that are kind of weird. The original version of this card says when this card is sent directly from your deck to the graveyard by an opponent's card effect, combine your graveyard cards with your own deck, shuffle them, and form a new deck. The specific words that confuse people with this effect are the combine, because why does it say that, and the new deck part, because it's not really a new deck, it's just the old deck reset. But what's funny is that that the most recent printing of this card is actually even more ridiculous. When this card is sent directly from your deck to the graveyard by an effect of a card controlled by your opponent, unite your graveyard cards and your own deck, shuffle them, and form a new deck. The parts of this effect that they decided to change were just really strange. Why did they feel that they had to change combine to unite? Both words basically mean the same thing in this context. Why does it say form a new deck when that's not really what you're doing? Compared to some of the other weird effects that I've talked about, Penguin Knight is pretty tame. However, it is still kind of strange, and a lot of you guys requested it, so I put it in today's video. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching the third episode of weird old card effects in Yu-Gi-Oh! If there's a card that hasn't been mentioned in the last couple of episodes, make sure to put it in the comment section below for a chance for it to make it into episode 4. Thank you guys so much for watching though. I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.